Good day, this is Jove Aguas, and welcome to my lectures in the Philosophy of Karol Wojtyla, or Saint John Paul II. In the second part of the lecture, I will be focusing on the philosophical influences of Karol Wojtyla. There are three important philosophical influences in Karol Wojtyla. First, Saint John of the Cross. Second is Saint Thomas Aquinas. And the third is the philosopher Max Scheler. Now, let's go to Saint Thomas Aquinas. This is the main influence of Karol Wojtyla, the influence of Saint Thomas Aquinas in his philosophy and in his theology. Wojtyla was first introduced to the philosophy of Saint Thomas when he was a seminarian, of course, because we know for a fact that the philosophy of Saint Thomas is taught in the seminary, being declared by Pope Leo XIII in 1879 as the official philosophy of the Church. So in the seminary, as a clandestine seminarian, his biggest problem was philosophy, especially metaphysics. Because of course, we know that anybody who enters the seminary for the first time, that would be the first time that he will encounter philosophy. We know that the background of Wojtyla was not really into philosophy. He was into theater. Okay, so the most important, one of the most difficult subjects in philosophy is metaphysics. And one of the books that they were assigned to read and digest for examination was the book Ontology or Metaphysics, okay, written by Reverend Professor Kazimierz Weiss of Lvov, that contains a dense and highly abstract formulas of the 20th century neo-scholasticism. So it was a difficult read for Karol Wojtyla. And although he found it difficult to read, according to Wojtyla, this opened his eyes and eventually aroused his interest on Thomism. So it was a difficult encounter, a difficult first encounter with the philosophy of St. Thomas, because the first course that he had to study and read is metaphysics. So, after ordination, he was sent to Rome to study at the Angelicum, the center of Thomistic thought, and there he pursued his doctoral degree. His initial youthful fascination with the system led him to a solid education in Thomism. And of course, he encountered in Angelicum one of the famed and respected professor in Thomism at the time, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. So, at the Angelicum, he intensified and expanded his training in Thomism, and under the influence of noted professors like Michael Brown, Maximilian de Fontersberg, Pierre-Paul Philippe, and Mario Schiappi, he blossomed into better understanding of Thomism. But none of them really had this much influence, a considerable influence on Wojtyla, than the French-born professor, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange of the Order of Preachers, who was considered to be the most distinguished authority in Christendom, in Thomism, in the tradition of the Leonine revival of the angelic doctor as the philosophical authority within the church. So I have mentioned that Pope Leo XIII already declared the philosophy of St. Thomas as the official philosophy of the church, and Garrigou-Lagrange followed that tradition. So Wojtyla was also acquainted with the works of the lay Thomists like Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson. These are two important contemporary Thomists, neo-Thomists, who had a great influence and who were very popular in Poland, that their works were even translated into Polish. They were the most existential and dynamic of the Thomist philosophers, and the influence was great in the Christian philosophy that vigorously flourished in Poland during the time. Maritain and Gilson's more vital exposition of Thomism helped to liberate Polish thinkers from the wooden textbook of Thomist or Thomism of earlier times. Um, some Thomists being more Thomist than St. Thomas, making them, these two, to appreciate, no, the Polish, to appreciate more fully the importance of removing Thomism from the narrow enclosures to which it had become accustomed, and to enter into conversation with all the living philosophies of the time. So, with Maritain in Gilson, Thomism was open to some other philosophies in order for Thomism to be more significant, more conversational, more attuned to the time. So that is the kind of Thomism that Wojtyla encountered during his time. But of course, he went back to St. Thomas to study St. Thomas himself, not just rely on the ideas of other Thomistic thinkers. Now, some important notions of St. Thomas that had great influence the philosophy of Karol Wojtyla. The first one is the notions of being, good, and participation. These are metaphysical concepts of St. Thomas Aquinas. But of course, the notion of being, of good, and participation of St. Thomas was greatly influenced by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who first articulated on these concepts, on these metaphysical concepts in his metaphysics. Okay? But of course, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote his own commentary on the metaphysics of Aristotle. So first, the good is identified with being. The good is one of the transcendental properties of being. Being is good. Why being is good? When you say being, being is anything that exists, anything that has existence. And for anything to exist, it is good in itself. So a being is good precisely because it exists. And therefore, for Wojtyla, Thomism is a philosophy of the good. Thomism is not just a philosophy of being, it is a philosophy of the good. And God is the highest being, and therefore, He is the highest good. He is not only the source of good, He is the highest good Himself. He is good Himself, the absolute good. Other entities are beings insofar as they participate in the being of God. We take part in the being of God. We are beings, we also exist, but our existence is owed from God. We participate in the existence of God. We participate in the sense that God created us. He gave us existence. Okay? So, therefore, there is a degree of perfection in all beings. A degree of perfection in all beings. There will always be the highest good, the highest being, who is God Himself, and then down the line to the lowest or the least perfect being. And matter would be the least perfect being. Because in philosophy, in this kind of metaphysics, we say that the more spiritual the being is, the higher its perfection. And because God is the most spiritual, He's the eternal, He's the absolute, He's the most perfect. And matter, because it's already devoid of spirituality, but it still exists, therefore it is still good, but it has the least perfection. So God as absolute good and perfection communicates being and goodness to everything that exists, including matter, of course. Other beings are good insofar as they participate in the good of the highest good, who is God Himself. And of course, their perfection also follows a kind of hierarchy. So there is a hierarchy of being, and there's also a hierarchy of good. So just as there is a hierarchy of being, meaning that is a metaphysical hierarchy, there's also a hierarchy of good inherent in all other beings. And therefore, for Aquinas, following St. Thomas, there is both a metaphysical order, meaning in the hierarchy of being, and an ethical order, meaning in the hierarchy of goodness. Because participation of being is also a participation in value. Good is a value. And among all created physical beings, man has the highest good, and therefore man has the highest value in all of God's creation, at least in the physical world. So, in every experience of a particular good, the intellect recognizes a relation with the good. The intellect recognizes a relation with the good. The object of the intellect is the truth, and the object of our will is the good. But our intellect recognizes this good. This is because reason, or the intellect, recognizes the good in and through particular things, and through the process of abstraction, reflection, and generalization upon the essence of the good. Thus, for Wojtyla, Thomism avoids the pitfall of upholding a notion of good that is completely cut off from experience, meaning we experience the good through particular things, through things. Okay? So, the good instead is immanent in particular experience. It is in the experience that we encounter the good. So, good is not some kind of an abstract notion for Wojtyla. This particular experience, of course, has its full bearing in our experience of the absolute good, who is God Himself. So if we encounter God in our mystical experience, going back to our discussion on faith according to St. John of the Cross, therefore, then we experience the absolute goodness of God. Now, the second important notion of Thomism that influenced Karol Wojtyla is the notion of the person. We are very familiar of the personalism of St. John Paul II or Karol Wojtyla. And he actually acquired this understanding of the person from St. Thomas. So, St. Thomas assumes the Boethian definition of person as individual substance of a rational nature. Man is a rational being, and he is an individual substance of this nature. The rational nature does not possess a genuine autonomous existence as nature because it subsists in a person. So you don't see a rational nature walking around. You see a person. And within this person, you find the rational nature. So the person subsists as an autonomous subject of existence and action. Meaning, the person is a being in itself, a substance, a being in itself, and it subsists, it exists, and it acts. In this sense, God is a person. God is a person because it exists and God and acts. In fact, we can say that God is the absolute person. Now, St. Thomas applies this notion of person in his treatise on the Trinity. You see, God has three persons: Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So, through the Trinity, we can say that God is a personal being. So, God for St. Thomas is a person, a subjective agent who puts his ideas into action, into being through his creative work. So God is a being, an absolute being. He has his ideas, exemplary ideas, and he puts through his creative beings, creative works, his ideas. He created the world. He created us. By participation, man is also a person because we also have this power, this ability, this nature of being rational. So man is also a person. He is also a suppositum. He is a subject who exists in itself and acts in himself. An individual substance which subsists in itself, who is also intelligent and who is also freely responsible, who determines his own existence and action. But of course, we are a person only by participation. We take part, we participate in the personhood of God. So, the significance of St. Thomas' philosophy to Wojtyla are as follows. 1. Philosophy of St. Thomas provides Wojtyla with the fundamental principles through which he adequately understood the human person and his personal relation with himself and his fellow persons, and most importantly, his personal relationship with God. However, Wojtyla realized that because of the influence of Aristotelian thought, St. Thomas developed his principles in a rather objectivistic way and failed to develop adequately the subjective side of the human person. So, the objective side of the human person is fully developed in St. Thomas Aquinas. But for Wojtyla, there is something that is lacking. There's something wanting on the subjective side of the human person. So what St. Thomas provides Wojtyla is an objective personalism, a set of objective features which are necessary to develop an authentic philosophy of the person or of the human person. But the subjective side was inadequately developed. Wojtyla explains that the Thomistic view of the person is an objective interpretation of man, which put emphasis on the fact that the person is a distinct subject of existence and activity, whose nature is rational, and that makes him capable of consciousness and self-consciousness. But he recognizes that there is a limitation of such interpretation in analyzing more deeply the nature of consciousness and self-consciousness, which are the main concerns of modern philosophy, especially during his time. Like other Thomists, Wojtyla praises the philosophy grounded on being for its ability to grasp and affirm all that shows itself in the human intellect as a determinate existing being in all the exhaustible richness of its contents. Wojtyla recognizes that, and he appreciates that in Thomism. However, he emphasizes that while St. Thomas provided us with an excellent view of the objective existence and activity of the person, it would be difficult to speak in St. Thomas's view of the lived experiences of the person. This lived experiences of the person is now the subjective side of the human person. So St. Thomas provided the objective side of the human person, and Wojtyla has to look somewhere for the subjective side of the human person. Meaning, he has to look a, for a philosophy that would show him the lived experiences, the subjective experiences of the person. So this inadequacy, as far as the subjective and human experience is concerned, was answered by Max Scheler with his brand of phenomenology. So the phenomenology of Max Scheler which will later be modified by Wojtyla to suit his own project, on the basis of personal experience, was an interpretation of the person that confirmed the ontology of the person based on St. Thomas. So for Wojtyla, this is the other side of the coin. This is something that will complement the ontology of the person based on St. Thomas Aquinas. So in this sense, Wojtyla integrates the Thomistic ontology of the person with the Ceylerian phenomenology of the person. The ontology, the objective side, and phenomenology, the subjective side or aspect of the human person.